in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar titled Special Education Rights of Students with Disabilities and Maximizing Educational Services and Supports. During this session, Ira Fingles of the law firm Hinkle, Fingles & Pryor, attorneys at law, will describe a broad scope of special education areas, including the goal of IDEA, the 6 steps of the special education process, and the purpose of an IEP and its components. Today's discussion will also offer strategies for effective collaboration with your local school district and ways for parents to successfully participate as equal members of their IEP team. While acknowledging the need for education around specific topics such as today's presentation, the Family Support Center of New Jersey also recognizes that families have specific questions around their child's transition years. The Transition Matters website assists families and professionals alike in identifying resources to successfully transition your child or student with special needs to adulthood. Resources such as webinars, in-person workshops, statewide and regional contact information are all made available on our site. We encourage you to explore this site further and register for any upcoming sessions that may benefit you and your family. Before we begin, let's take a moment to go over how you can participate during today's web event. Everyone has their own control panel in the upper right corner of their screen that looks similar to the one here. Use the orange arrow to open or hide your control panel. To listen to the webinar, you have 2 audio options to choose from: mic and speakers and telephone. If you can't hear well using your computer speakers, you can elect to use your telephone to listen to today's session. In order to maintain the best sound quality possible, all but the presenters will be muted throughout today's webinar. If you have questions or comments, you can submit them using the questions panel. All questions will be collected and answered at the end of the webinar as long as time allows. I do want to point out one additional feature that we have on today's webinar. On the right side, you should see an option that says handouts. Ira Fingles was kind enough to provide his PowerPoint as a PDF that you can access during the presentation or that you can print to make notes on. At this time, I would like to introduce today's presenter, Attorney Ira Fingles. Ira, welcome.
Thank you so much, Melanie. Thank you so much for having us, and thank you to the Family Support Center of New Jersey for providing this series, which I hope is helpful for everybody involved. And if you'll all bear with me, I think I did it.
You did it. Thank you.
This is all 21st century stuff for an old man, so thank you for bearing with me, audience. But the topic we're going to talk about today is maximizing educational services and supports. And I was explaining to Melanie, I'll explain to you as we go through, that it's a subject that for some reason I just have never been able to really make fun. If you've ever been to any of my workshops or our workshops in the office, or if you've seen other webinars on different topics, we try to make this stuff fun. There's something about basic special education rights that's just no fun, but you do need to know it, and I am going to try to show it to you. Let me give another warning that what I've done with the PowerPoint today is take our old material, which was real boring, 6 steps of special education process, and we'll talk about it, and you'll see that you're bored. And I've really tried to intersperse information that I think is of more relevance to most of the questions that parents ask me when they come in for consultations or when they're sitting next to me on the bus or whatever. So it might be a little disjointed. I apologize for that, but hopefully by the end of the show you have the information you need, and I will make sure that we leave time for questions so that if we don't give you what you need, then we can still have a chance to try. That's our firm, Hinkle, Fingles & Pryor. I appreciate Melanie's stating the firm name accurately. You wouldn't believe the variations we get: Hinkles, Fingles, and Pringles, and Hinkles, Jingles, and whatever. And we actually at one point wanted to hire an attorney named Steve Funk. Steve, I hope you're not out there listening. I'm sorry we couldn't hire you because Hinkle, Finkles, and Funk, that just would have been too good. There's a starting place that most of the presentations that I see don't start at, and ours didn't until today. So you're the inaugural audience for my starting at this point. But I went back after doing this for 23 years and read the special education statute, and in bright, golden letters was the goal of the IDEA, what Congress was trying to achieve when they passed the law. The IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It was a law passed in 1975. That's as much law, professor, as I'm going to play with you today. But at the very beginning of the law, there's a statement of what Congress's goal is, and Congress stated very clearly that they have very specific goals. And the goal is to prepare students with disabilities for success after graduation in 3 specific areas: employment, further education, and independent living. And it didn't take long for me to figure out that this is exactly what we're trying to do for all kids, whether they have disabilities or not. We're just trying to make sure that the students with disabilities who might require additional supports and assistance in attaining those goals get those additional supports and assistance. But whenever a question comes up at an IEP meeting or in a due process hearing or in any other context about whether a student needs something or whether a student has a right to something or whether the school district's position may be right, the first thing that I've done, for the past decade now is, excuse me, go back to those goals and try to figure out, is what we're talking about something that's going to allow the student to have a greater chance of being successful after graduation in employment, further education, or independent living? We're going to recognize that not all students are going to achieve these goals fully. Not everybody's going to enter into fully independent, competitive employment. Not everybody's going to go on to a 4-year college. Further education, by the way, covers community college, VOTEC. It can cover day training programs if that's the level the student is operating at after graduation. It just means further education means we'll have the student prepared to continue skill building activities after graduation. And independent living, it's our hope that we're going to have children who live independently and can make their own way in the world and stand on all 10 of their little toes, but we recognize that due to their disabilities, many of them won't be able to do that, but we certainly want to continue to work towards that as a goal so that they can be as independent as possible, not only for their own good. It's obviously a great benefit to themselves if the student, the adult now after graduation, is able to do things for him or herself and lessen his or her dependency on others, but it's a societal goal that to the extent that we can have people with disabilities doing things for themselves to the greatest extent possible, then we're able to divert resources to others who may be in greater need. The way that the IDEA accomplishes or seeks to accomplish these goals of allowing students to achieve success in those 3 areas is by providing students with a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. That's the mandate. That's what Congress ordered the states to make sure happens for students with disabilities, and New Jersey, just like every other state, has delegated that responsibility by and large to local school districts. So it's the local school district's responsibility to ensure that each student with a disability receives a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment, and that's going to set the tone for the rest of what we're going to talk about this afternoon. So what is FAPE? What is a free appropriate public education? A free appropriate public education is special education and related services, and we're going to dig in a little bit to what those terms mean because it's not as clear as we might think or as we might like, but that they're provided at no cost. That's an important point. Parents often come into my office and tell me that they've been paying for private therapy outside of school, for example, to help the student who has difficulty with executive functioning issues, organizational issues, getting things done, and as being as far over on the parent side as I can be as an advocate, it always comes to my mind that this is something that's going to help the student with those goals of being independent, successful in further education, going on to employment, and therefore we might have an argument that the school district may be responsible for those costs. Parents who are paying for private therapy, speech therapy, occupational therapy, behavior therapy, think about whether or not you should be paying for those things, or whether you might want to look into whether the school district should be paying for those additional therapies because you're providing them because your child needs them. And if your child needs them, then the law requires that they be provided at no cost to the student by the local school district. The related services in special education are going to be provided pursuant to an individualized educational program, which we're going to spend a little bit of time on today. We're going to work on a workshop together with the Family Support Center of New Jersey that's going to get into IEPs in gory detail. If you're masochist, then you're entitled and welcome to join in that. And we're going to design all these services, the special education related services that are going to be laid out in the IEP to meet the unique educational needs of the student, which is a term that is cliche, it's hackneyed, we use it all the time. We say that we're going to meet students' unique needs. We can look at the name of the law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and we can gather that we're focusing upon individual needs, but it's something that I don't think we should be giving short shrift to, that every student has the right to be examined and treated as a unique individual, which means that we should try to be careful, and we should at least get our hackles up when we hear the idea of, oh, Johnny has autism, so we'll place him in the autism class, or Johnny has a behavioral disability, so we'll place him into the behavioral disabilities program, or decisions that don't seem to take into account the full breadth and depth and scope and all the uniqueness and wonderfulness of Johnny. Hopefully some of you have kids named Johnny and you're smiling right now because I said nice things about him. If your kid's not named Johnny, I still think they're really cool. This is where I'm going off track. This used to be something that was at the end of the presentation that I want to move up to the very beginning because I think it's one of the key concepts that parents don't get told, that nobody's writing this in the parental rights and special education book. Nobody's telling you this in the IEP meeting, certainly, and this information that's on the next couple of slides, I think, is critical to you as parents, assuming you're parents, or you as educators, if you're educators, to understanding just how intensive the students' rights are under the IDEA. The IDEA takes a very broad definition of education. We're not just talking about academics. Like a child without a disability, we can probably get through K to 12 and just think about math and reading, and every now and then a behavioral issue may come up. We deal with it. Every now and then a social skills issue may come up. It gets dealt with, but not in any planned, systematic way. Children with disabilities may have non-academic issues aside from reading, writing, math that are going to wreck their abilities to have any chance of success at employment, further education, or independent living after graduation, and often that is the impediment. Those things, those non-academic areas, are the impediments that we should be spending a lot of time focusing upon. So a student's IEP must appropriately address all areas of need that result from the student's disabilities that might interfere with the student's ability to succeed after graduation in employment, further education, or independent living. I've thrown this question out to audiences for 23 years now. I'll throw it out to you, and if anybody has an answer, then Melanie has explained to you how you can put questions forward, come up with something. I can only think of two things that a parent can go to the IEP table and say, my child's having a problem in this area. It might interfere with employment, further education, or independent living after graduation. Therefore, I want it addressed in the IEP. And the school district gets to say, no, that's not an educational need therefore we're not going to address it. The two things are medical services, which are defined by the United States Supreme Court as services that are provided by medical doctors, MDs. So we're not talking about cognitive behavioral therapy, which is provided by psychologists. Many parents ask for cognitive behavioral therapy or other types of counseling or therapy, and they're told, no, you need to get that from your insurance company or from some other agency because it's a medical service. Or you ask for additional speech therapy or occupational therapy, and they say, no, we think 2 sessions is enough to meet the student's school-based speech therapy needs or occupational therapy needs, and any additional needs are medical. The only thing that's medical is a service that must be provided by an MD. So we're talking about things like surgery, which we're not going to ask the school district for in the first place, writing prescriptions, diagnosing certain conditions, things that aren't going to come up in the IEP process in the first place. But medical services are off the table. And religious services, we have the First Amendment of the Constitution that says thou shalt not intertwine 9 churches and 9 schools. So we can't go to the school district and ask for bar mitzvah training or First Communion or anything religious in nature. Those are 2 absolutes. Other than that, I can't think of a thing that if we can identify a skill deficit that may interfere with a student's ability to succeed after graduation in those 3 areas that I keep saying, I won't repeat them again, that the school district gets to say, no, that's not something we have to deal with. If your child has an issue that may interfere with their ability to succeed after graduation in those areas that we've identified, and it's not, and the remedy for it isn't treatment by an MD or by a rabbi or by a cleric, then the school district can't get off the hook from answering by saying it's not an educational need. Everything else is educational. It's a mind-blowing concept, and it's something that hopefully you'll be able to take to the IEP table to expand the range of services that your child is able to receive to address these issues that may be problematic after graduation. So some areas of educational need that are potentially interfering with the student's ability to succeed after graduation. Obviously, academics. We're not going to ignore academics regardless of the student's skill level. We may adjust the academic component of the program to meet the student's abilities based upon the student's ability to perform academic skills, but academics is certainly going to be a part of the student's educational program. But the student's educational program also needs to address, to the extent that these things are problems resulting from the disability that may interfere with the student's ability to be successful after graduation, we need to address behavior. We need to address social skills. We need to address emotional functioning. A student who's withdrawn, depressed, anxious, school districts are very quick to say those aren't educational issues, but if they might get in the way of the student being successful after graduation, then you have a right to at least talk about it during the IEP process. I can't guarantee that you'll get services to address it, but I can guarantee that they cannot shut that conversation down by saying that these are not educational issues. And I'll take it a step further just because this came up yesterday in a case. Parents of a child, a child whose parents are going through a very contentious divorce, and the child has become very anxious, very depressed, and has refused to go back to school so far this year. And the school district is saying it's not our problem because the student's anxiety and depression result from the parents' divorce and all the problems in the household, and therefore these aren't educational issues. But will this student be able to get a job, go to college, live independently if he doesn't end up going back to school at some point? No. Therefore, it's something they have to deal with. They might not like the reason that they have to deal with it. They might not feel that it's fair that they have to get involved in issues that don't seem to relate directly to the typical school experience, but that's the whole idea of the special ed system, that we're taking the child as we find him or her and addressing his or her unique needs, and this student's unique need relating from his parents' divorce is that he's not going to school, and not going to school tends to interfere with the student's ability to learn, and that tends to interfere with the student's ability to be successful after graduation. So self-care skills, dressing, bathing, feeding, all those things, to the extent the student has disabilities that interfere with the ability to engage in and complete activities of daily living, those can be and should be addressed in the IEP if the student has deficits that result from their disabilities in those areas. Physical skills, so fine and gross motor skills, sensory skills, and this is just a sampling. Anything you can think of that is a skill deficit that results from the student's disability and the treatment for it isn't MD and isn't Rabbi, then throw me a question and say, is a school district allowed to say no to this because it's not educational? And my bet is that I'm going to say no. You at least have to talk about it, and they have to engage you in a meaningful discussion about whether or not the student requires assistance through the special ed system in those areas. It's a good time to use the word meaningful. This term appropriate is thrown around, and this is where the fight lies. If we're going to have a fight with the school district, if there's going to be disagreement, it's typically going to be over what's appropriate for the student. The school district will offer an IEP, and they'll say that the IEP is appropriate, that it meets the student's needs, and the parents will say, we don't think it is appropriate based upon whatever information they have. It's the same IEP as last year, didn't work last year, so we don't expect it to work this year, so we don't think it's appropriate. Or our private speech language therapist, even though I told you before, you don't have to pay for those, but you're certainly entitled to. The private speech language therapist thinks that the student needs more speech therapy, and the school district says, no, we think the amount of speech therapy we're giving is appropriate. The arguments center around what is and what isn't appropriate, and appropriate has a meaning. It's a legal definition. A legally appropriate IEP, and this is a mouthful, but we're going to break it down and make sure that you understand it, that a legally appropriate IEP is an IEP that's designed to confer significant and meaningful benefit in all areas impacted by the student's disabilities. So let's break that down a little bit. It's designed to confer benefit in all areas impacted by the student's disabilities. That's what we just went through. Any area of deficit resulting from the student's disability that may interfere with his ability to succeed after graduation and for employment, further education, or independent living should be addressed in the IEP. The IEP is going to be designed to allow the student to progress in significant and meaningful ways to overcome the limitations of their disabilities. Significant and meaningful are important words. They're also mushy words. Attorneys like mushy words because we get to say that our interpretation of significant and meaningful is the right one and yours is the wrong one. But when we're looking at skills and the development of skills, we want to make sure that we're not just making some progress, but that we're making meaningful progress, that we're making strides that will allow the student to reach those goals of being successful after graduation and by the time of graduation. So we need to make sure that the progress in all of these areas that we're focusing upon is significant and meaningful. An easy example is academics. A student with an average IQ should be able to make at least a year's progress in reading for each year of instruction. That's not automatic, and I'm sure there's a million learning consultants that will roll their eyes at that, but by and large, if the student's IQ is in the average range, then we should expect at least a year's progress for a year's instruction. If we have a student who is falling further and further behind in reading, even though the student has an average IQ, then we can argue that that progress is not significant and meaningful. The reason for that is because when we're considering whether the progress is significant or meaningful, we have to take into account the student's potential to make progress. IQ is a measure of intelligence. It's a measure of a student's potential to make progress in academic areas. So if the student has an average IQ, we would expect the student to have the potential to make a year's worth of progress. So if the student is only making a half a year's progress every year, and after 2, 3, 4 years of this now is 2 or 3 grade levels behind in reading, then first of all, that's the basis for diagnosing a reading disability. So that's an important point. And it's also a basis for the parents to be concerned that the services that are being provided are not conferring the significant and meaningful benefit in the area of reading that the student is entitled to, because the student's not keeping up with the level that we would expect based upon his potential. So that's an easy one. That's a gimme, reading. It gets harder, but not impossible with non-academic areas like behavior or social skills or emotional functioning. But we still use that same concept, that to the extent the student has the potential to make progress that's going to get him or her closer to those goals or to achieve those goals of being able to enter into employment, further education, independent living after graduation, but the student isn't making that level of progress that's actually going to make that happen, then the parent has a good foothold to argue that the services provided under the IEP or the IEP itself is not appropriate because the student is not making progress that we could call significant and meaningful. Significant and meaningful means it's going to have a positive impact on the child's life. And going right back to that first slide that I'm now so happy I put that first, that the significant and meaningful progress is going to advance the child towards those goals of being independent after or successful after graduation in employment, further education, independent living. When we're talking about whether progress is significant or meaningful, we have to think about the concept of generalization. This comes up most often in the context of behavior. So those of you who have children with behavioral disabilities, autism is the one that comes to mind first for me, that a student with autism, by definition, has difficulty generalizing skills. Generalizing skills means the student's able to take what's learned in one setting and apply it in different settings. There are different types of generalization. There's generalization between places. So a student can learn a skill in school and be able to demonstrate the skill in school, whether it's being able to control his or her behavior or interact appropriately with peers or do math. Whatever the skill is, the student may be great in the schoolhouse and able to do that, but as soon as the student gets home, those skills go out the window. That means the student's having difficulty with generalization among places, and this is often the case with students with autism, that their behavior can be controlled and managed while they're in school, but once they get home, their behavior regresses. It goes back to a lower level, and they demonstrate higher levels of inappropriate behavior. That shows that they haven't generalized whatever skill development has been produced through the educational program. There's generalization among people. So sometimes the student's able to respond appropriately to the teacher because that's what the student's used to, and the student has been working with the teacher for several weeks or several months or several years, and when the student asks, and then when the teacher asks the student to demonstrate a skill, whether it's behave appropriately or touch your nose or count coins or whatever it may be, the student's able to do it. But when somebody else does it, maybe a parent, maybe somebody in the community, the student's not able to do it. That's another type of lack of generalization. And a third type of generalization difficulty that students run into is environments, that in different environments, No, environments is the same as places. People, places, materials, I'm sorry. Scratch environments, write in materials, that students are able to generalize sometimes or unable to generalize with certain materials. So if they're doing math worksheets, they can do the math worksheet just fine, but when the actual math problem comes up in the grocery store and they have to make change, they're not able to do it because they're not using the same materials that they're used to. So Melanie, remind me, I have to go back and fix this slide, but the point is that students with disabilities can have difficulty generalizing skills, using skills in all settings and all opportunities that the skills are required, not just in the school building. It's an important point for parents, particularly of kids with autism, to understand, because a student who's able to behave appropriately in school but can't control his or her behavior appropriately in the home and the community is going to have difficulty after graduation in employment, further education, and independent living, and therefore we're not making that significant and meaningful progress towards achieving a meaningful outcome in the area of behavior for that student. Parents, because of these issues with generalization, school districts, if there are school district people out there, you're welcome to wave your hands around. I can't see them, but they hate this slide. It's up to the school district to a great extent to address problems with generalization. If a student is having difficulty generalizing skills and isn't able, for example, to behave appropriately outside of school in the home and community, but is able to behave appropriately in school, then it's not enough for the school district to say, well, we don't see it in school. When the parent says, Johnny's having behavior problems, and we don't know what to do. We're at our wits' end. We've been to every training that the Family Support Center's offered and that Autism New Jersey's offered, and we've done all these workshops and read all these articles, and we're just not able to get Johnny to behave more appropriately outside of school. The school district doesn't get to just wash their hands and say, well, we're doing what we have to do because his behavior is under control from 8:30 to 2:30, because the lack of behavioral control outside of the school hours means that we haven't achieved meaningful control over the student's behavior, which goes back to that definition of appropriate. An appropriate IEP is one that's going to confer meaningful benefits. It's not a meaningful benefit for a student to be a good student while he's in school, but to be a hellcat when he's out in the diner or the mall or the movie theater or in the home. And there are plenty of families that can't take their kids to these places because their behavior is so out of control. So there are different ways that school districts can be responsible for addressing problems with generalization. One of them is parent training, and that's often the first thing that's offered. And I would recommend to you parents, don't turn it down. It doesn't look good. It doesn't look good to a judge when you get to a due process hearing, which hopefully never happens, and you're asking for more intensive services, and the school district's able to say, well, we asked the parents to be a part of the team to help address these generalization problems, these out-of-school behavior problems, and the parent refused and said that it's the school district's job. So don't turn it down because it's going to make it harder for me to wing your hearing, and I'd really like to wing your hearing. But also don't turn it down because you are the primary change agents in your child's life outside of school. In school, they have control of your child. They have the ability to tweak things and modify things and to make adjustments, and you don't have much control while they're in the school building because they're out of your custody and control. But most of the time, from that 2:30 p.m. to 8:30 a.m. the next day and all of the weekend, you are the ones who are in the position to help change your child's behavior, to help change your child's performance. So if parent training is offered, accept it, participate in it. Where I get irritated is when school districts offer parent training and nothing but parent training. It's not a parent's job, in my opinion, to completely take over responsibility for addressing disability-related skill deficits because of that stuff that we've been talking about up until this point, that they're obligated to address all areas of functioning. They're obligated to provide an IEP that provides significant and meaningful benefit. They're obligated to address generalization problems that result from the child's disability. So other ways that school districts might get involved in helping with generalization is by providing the student, if the student is having problems with social skills, for example, provide the student with a social skills group outside of school. Maybe there's a social skills group in school that is just as good, and maybe that solves the problem. But if what's being done in school isn't enough to promote generalization of social skills, then maybe providing the student with some opportunities for a social skills group after school would be appropriate, or if the student's having problems with other areas, other types of groups after school. The big one that school districts are very hesitant to step into, but it's becoming more and more the norm, and parents should feel more and more comfortable asking for these services, are home and community-based instruction after school, on weekends if it's necessary. In some cases, intensive instruction may be required, 10 to 20 hours a week. It's not uncommon, particularly children with autism are getting after-school programs of one-to-one applied behavior analysis therapy, 2 hours a day or 3 hours a day. I have kids who get it, 4 hours a day during the week, and then they get 6 hours a day Saturday, 6 hours a day Sunday. We have kids who get even more intensive levels of out-of-school one-to-one assistance to work on areas of need. Usually the area of need is behavior, but don't misunderstand me to be saying that it's only behavior. I'll use making a student's bed. If the child is in a classroom and at school in a life skills class and they have a bed that they teach the child how to make the bed, and the child's able to make the bed in the life skills classroom but can't make his bed at home, that may signal a need for somebody to come to the home, an instructor to come to the home to teach the child how to make his own bed in his own home, because he's not generalizing that skill from the mock-up bed in the classroom to his actual bed in the home. And nobody can argue that the goal of teaching the child how to make the bed in school is because the bed in school is unruly looking and the superintendent might show up. It's because we're trying to teach the child how to make the bed. If it's not working with simply providing in-school instruction, then providing instruction in the student's home might be necessary. Another example that comes from a case I did a number of years ago, a student had worked on turn taking for years. Again, a student with autism, learning how to take turns, learning how to wait until it was his turn to speak or to act or to do whatever it was that needed to be done. And he had turn taking down. It was, mastered as far as the school records went, but the school took a field trip to McDonald's, and the student is waiting in line, which is a form of turn taking, and the student is standing in line but facing the wrong way and staring directly into the eyes of the person behind him and making that person really uncomfortable. It didn't cause a problem. There was an instructor there to tell Johnny, turn around, face front, but that was a great illustration that Johnny hadn't fully mastered the skill of turn taking and hadn't fully generalized those skills, and only by getting him into the community to see whether he actually can demonstrate that skill in a community setting were we able to figure out that he needed a little more work on turn taking. So it wasn't a lot of work, but that was an important lesson that was learned. So getting the one-to-one out of school instruction, whether it's in life skills or behavior or emotional functioning or social skills, these are things that you as parents should feel comfortable asking for, and you as school districts should be comfortable responding to, and recognizing that we're not going to give the student his educational due if we ignore the problems that happen outside of the 8:30 to 2:30 school day. Other ways to promote generalization: coordination with other service providers. There are plenty of students who are receiving services through Perform Care or through other agencies, and working with those agencies makes all the sense in the world. Making sure that the school district and Perform Care are addressing behavioral issues in a consistent and planned way is a really good way to make sure that the student will be able to generalize the skills. And the final thing on this list is residential placement. There's some kids, obviously a very small minority, but some kids who have such difficulty with generalizing that they can only learn if they're taught on an all waking hours, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week basis, so that every time they demonstrate an inappropriate skill, they get the same response, whether it's at 8:30 in the morning getting ready to go to school, or 4 o'clock in the afternoon while they're in their residence, or if they wake up at 3 in the morning. And when they demonstrate appropriate skills, we want them to get a consistent response. That's the way to make sure that behavior is changed. That's what applied behavior analysis is all about, and consistency is key, and sometimes we can only achieve that degree of consistency by having the student in a residential placement. So this is the stuff that I'm going to fly through this. If anybody has questions about it, then like I said, I will leave time for questions, and we can go through the questions. But the special education process, I've broken down into 6 steps. I'm not sure that you'll find this anywhere else, but I do believe that this is accurate, and nobody's told me to the contrary over a couple decades of doing this, that the 6 steps of the educational process are identification, evaluation, classification, development of the IEP, development of the placement, repeat. Parental participation is required at each step, or is at least allowed, permitted for. You don't have to do it. Parents don't have to show up at IEP meetings. The school district still has to do the IEP, but the parent has a right to be a part of the team developing the IEP. The parent has a right to be a part of the team deciding upon the evaluation. So that was very intentional on Congress's part. It was confirmed by the Supreme Court. I promised I wouldn't play law professor, so I'll stop. But this is not just the law according to Fingles. Identification, that just means somebody says this kid might have a disability. Evaluation, process of gathering information to answer 2 questions. Does the student have a disability? And if so, what does the child need to receive the free appropriate public education that we've been trying to flesh out throughout the course of this webinar? Parents who disagree with school district evaluations are entitled to request independent evaluations, and it's a very powerful tool. We'll do workshops throughout the fall and the spring in a variety of fora. If you check our website, you'll see that we're doing workshops 4 in the fall, 4 in the spring, just on independent evaluation. So if that's a topic that's of interest to you, then you'll have opportunities to learn more about independent evaluations. But very powerful tool that Congress gave parents to try to make sure that the record, the playing field is level, that we don't just have the school district's information in the file with nothing to counterbalance it if we're suspicious that they may not have gotten it right. Classification is something that most of your kids have already been through. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. There's 13 eligibility categories. They're listed on this slide. Take a look. You might recognize the one that fits your kid. This next slide, program then placement, I do want to spend a short time talking about, because what we're leading into is step 4 of the process, which is IEP, and I want to make sure that we understand the theoretical basis of making placement decisions. The placement is the child's educational placement must be based upon the IEP. you'll have seen, you maybe noticed on the earlier slide that listed the steps of the process, that placement was step 5, IEP is step 4. We need to figure out, and this is theoretical, we're all placement centric. I am too. We all go into IEP meetings. I don't want to say all, but many times we go into the IEP meeting saying that, instead of having Johnny in the learning support class, we're going to have him in the self-contained class, or we're going to have him in the approved private school, or we're focusing on where we want him to be without really going through all the steps that are required before that to figure out why does he need to be there. But the law requires that we develop the IEP, meaning we figure out the package of special education or related services that the student requires before we make any decisions about where the student will be placed. The reason we do this is so we don't get hung up before we decide what the student needs on issues of cost. If the school that the student requires in order to receive the services spelled out in the IEP happens to cost a lot of money, it doesn't mean that we're going to start changing the services in the IEP to fit the student into a cheaper school. So by deciding on the IEP components first, we don't have to worry that we're going to have costs coming into the equation. Cost should never be a factor in deciding what a child needs in terms of receiving an appropriate education. We're not going to get hung up on whether or not we have enough staff available. Oh, he needs 3 sessions of speech therapy per week, but the therapist only has enough room on her dance card for 2 sessions per week, so now we're going to write an IEP that says he only gets 2 sessions a week? No, we're going to decide first that he needs 3 sessions a week and have that written down, and then we're going to make the decision about how we do that without getting hung up on staff availability, space limitations. We don't have enough room. We would love to have a quiet timeout room for Johnny for when he's about to when he's showing signs of going into meltdown. We'd like to have a place for him to go where he can settle down, but we don't have enough room for it. Wrong. We're going to decide first that that's something that he needs, and then we're going to make sure that wherever he's placed has the place that he can go to cool down. Otherwise, we risk leaving that out of the IEP just because we don't have anywhere to do it. And administrative convenience, no surprise to you, by now you figured out that I'm not real sympathetic to school districts' arguments that it would be hard for us to do something. I'm sorry if it's hard for them. I am sorry, because I don't think school districts are given the support that they need to provide an appropriate education for every student, and that's a political issue that I'm happy to take up with any of you at any point in time, but it certainly isn't a reason to take something out of students' IEP or change any of the content of the IEP.
Excuse me, Ira?
This slide just lays out, yes.
We have about 5 more minutes until the question answer period. Let me take as much time as you need, but I just want to give you a warning. Okay?
Yeah, and I appreciate that, Melanie, and I need that, and you know that, so thank you. So the IEP team, read it on your own time. There's nothing in here that's magical except that, number one, member, parents, you're part of the IEP team. You're equal participants on the IEP team. You know the child best. You know the child when he's out of school. You know the child when he's at family functions. You know the child when he's under stress, under demand, getting in fights with his or her sister, shaving the cat. You've got a lot of information to know that must be known by the IEP team if the IEP is going to be appropriate. The rest will skip. The IEP's purpose is to lay out the services and supports that will be provided, provide accountability if the IEP is done right, and we're going to do this real quick in a second, but if it's done right, it feeds back the information to the parents about whether or not the IEP is working. You need to know if it's working. You can't rely on the notes that come home in a journal that say, Johnny had a great day at school today. It's a pleasure to have Johnny in school. We need more specific information to know whether or not Johnny really is getting significant and meaningful benefit from his or her education. And the IEP promotes parental involvement. It's a chance for the parent to sit down around the table with a bunch of other people who all have different things to add to the process and to have a good conversation about how we're going to meet Johnny's needs. Components of the IEP, very quickly. Present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, another typo, not educational performance. This is the starting point. The IEP tells us where is Johnny as of the date of the IEP. Next is goals and objectives, which is where do we want him to be 1 year from now. Goals are annual goals. So here he is as of September 16th, 2015. Where do we want him to be as of September 15th, 2016? That's how we set the goals, by determining what level of performance we can expect. And that's where we get into the discussion of significant and meaningful. Maybe the district's setting the goals too low and we don't think that they're challenging enough, and we can argue that he can do better if we give him more appropriate intensive services, different staff, whatever. We're going to have a statement of special education, related services, modifications, and accommodations. I'm going to skip through that even though I promised to get into it. Placement is where the student receives the services. They're spelled out in the IEP, and I'll just leave it at what I said already, that we're deciding what goes into the IEP and what the student's getting before we're deciding where the student gets it. When we're talking about placement, this is where we run into least restrictive environment. The definition of least restrictive environment is right here on the page. Please read it, not now. A lot of parents come to us. New Jersey's rich in private schools for students with disabilities. It's how the system was built from the beginning. New Jersey had the first special education system in the country, and it worked on a model that students with disabilities would be sent out to private schools that specialize in that student's area of need, and the least restrictive environment requirement of the IEP is a little bit at odds with that. The least restrictive environment requirement requires that students be educated alongside non-disabled peers in regular education settings whenever possible, and we're in the middle of a push and pull with the Department of Education of New Jersey and the United States Department of Education about how do we fix this. But many parents come to us because they want their child placed into a specialized school with for kids with autism, or for kids with dyslexia, or for kids with emotional issues, or whatever it may be. And here are some of the reasons that you might want to consider if you're interested in seeking an out-of-district placement. These are some of the things that are often relied upon by parents, IEP teams, and ultimately judges, if it comes to that, in deciding whether the student can or should be educated in a special education school or in a specialized school for kids with disabilities. This slide, I ain't talking about. This is in here because you need to know it. It's about transition planning. Melanie mentioned that the Family Support Center of New Jersey has a very intensive transition planning program that you can get huge amounts of information about, learn everything you need to learn about transition planning. Transition planning is a requirement of a student's IEP starting at age 14, but really, cutting it in at full speed no later than the IEP that's in effect at age 16. And the information on this slide is the subject of other workshops that we're doing with the Family Support Center about how to work with agencies that serve students after they graduate, such as the Division of Developmental Disabilities. So that's in there to give you a teaser and maybe an invitation to participate in those other workshops that FSC is offering. And this is my last slide, how to get best outcomes with the fewest headaches. This is just a small sampling. There's a million different ways. Some of the more obvious, though, are be respectful. I can't stress enough. A judge hates to see a case come through the door where the parent has sent letters to the director of special education saying, I don't know how you ever got your degree. It's obvious that you don't care at all about students with disabilities. It's obvious that you're not competent at your job. That's not going to get you anywhere, and it's going to set you back. It's just going to make it harder to get what you need. So do what you need to do. Practice your mindfulness, do your meditation, your yoga, take your Xanax, whatever it is, to remember that the people on the other side of the table are still people. They still deserve respect. They went into these fields because they really did want to help kids with disabilities. They're stuck in a system that doesn't always allow them to do the right thing. They may be frustrated as well that they can't do what's right for Johnny. And the more you make enemies out of them, the harder you make it for yourself. And to the contrary, the more they like you, then the easier things are going to go. So you don't have to show up with cupcakes and birthday hats on their birthday, but certainly be careful not to make it personal. Make a clear paper trail. Anything significant that is said, make sure that it's in writing, whether it's a letter from you saying, I think that Johnny needs X, Y, and Z, or confirmation of a conversation you had with the case manager. The case manager said something that you thought was important, that we're planning on placing Johnny into the self-contained class for next year. Make sure it's in writing. Send an email back to the case manager. I was interested in your statement about the self-contained program for next year. It doesn't have to be the focus of the letter. It can be, how was your summer? Hope everything's going great with your son and his trip to Italy. And, by the way, I just want you to know that, I was concerned about your statement about next year, whatever. But if it's not in writing, it didn't happen, because the he said, she said, the school districts always win because they're the government. You're just a parent, and I don't agree with it, but he said, she said battles are very difficult to win. So get everything in writing. Use your information advantage. I already said, you know your kid better than anybody else. Document it. If your kid's having behavioral problems outside of school, keep a log. Keep track of how many times your child's engaging in aggressive behavior or self-injurious behavior, or if your kid's having anxiety, and comes home crying every day. Make a record of that. Have a journal that you pass back and forth to the school district, because they're giving you progress reports saying that he's doing great. You can give them your side of the story. Maybe he's doing great, and that's what's going to be in your progress report. But whatever it is, make a record of what you're seeing, because you've got him, remember, from 2:30 p.m. to 8:30 a.m. and then all weekend. You know a lot more about him than they do. You can document that, and then that can be real helpful in terms of resolving disputes that come up down the road. Hire an expert or a consultant. Very important. I think it's, just should be automatic that you get somebody on your team, somebody that, preferably if you're able, you hire privately, and they evaluate your kid, they write a report, they say what your child needs, and then the argument, if there's going to be an argument, is between them and your expert, who's probably going to know a lot more lingo and be in a far better position to articulate the arguments of why whatever you're asking for is needed. Give credit where it's due. That goes back to being respectful, and keep an open mind. Don't just assume that they're out to get your kid. Maybe when they offer a program, even if you suspect it's not appropriate, take a look at it. If not because you're really interested in learning about it, because it makes it look like you're interested in learning about it. That's the end of my thing. I didn't leave time for questions like I promised. I can answer questions, Melanie, if there's any time or ability technologically, but I'll leave that up to you, Melanie, but that's the end of my workshop.
So why don't we grab a handful of questions real quick, if your schedule allows, Ira?
It absolutely does.
Perfect. So, one of the first questions I want to get to is, because you just addressed this, I think on a previous slide, is, do agreements made in an email but not included in an IEP hold any legal weight?
I'm sorry, say that again. cut out for a second.
Well, that's
Say
okay.
it again.
Do agreements made in an email but not included in the IEP hold any legal weight?
Yes, they hold weight, but at the end of the day, you're far safer making sure that it's included in the IEP. So when you get the agreement in the email, to send back an email, okay, can we, amend Johnny's IEP to include this? The law allows amendments without meetings if both parties agree. But an email agreement, it does carry weight.
Perfect. And the next question is going to be a two-part question. How many days does a school district have to hold an IEP following an IEP request? And once the IEP is held, how many days do the supports and services have to start from the time that the IEP is signed?
The first one, I can answer both. The first one, it's mythology. We have this 15-day thing in New Jersey that everybody's got in their heads, and a lot of people misunderstand it to mean that they have to have, strike that, 20 days for I misunderstood the question as I'm rethinking it. When a parent requests an IEP meeting, the school district has 20 days to convene the IEP. That also applies if a parent requests a change in the IEP. They don't have to say, I want an IEP meeting. If the parent writes a letter that says, I want more speech therapy, then the district has to have an IEP meeting within 20 days to make a decision on that request. So that's part one. Part two, the 15 days is after the district develops the IEP, presents the IEP to the parent. They have to wait 15 days before they can implement the IEP. The reason for that is to give parents the chance to challenge the IEP through mediation or due process. If the parents do that within 15 days, then they block the IEP from going into effect, which we call stay put. So if the student is in a private school, gets an IEP that says he's not going to go into a self-contained class in the public school, and the parents object to that, the district can't move the child for 15 days, and if the parents file for mediation or due process within those 15 days, then the student remains in the private school while the parents go through all of the dispute resolution procedures, which are mediation, due process hearings, appeals to state or federal court, appeals to higher level state or federal courts. The process can run a long time. So they have to wait 15 days. The signature at the end of the IEP, read what you're signing, because what it says, it doesn't say I agree with the IEP. It says I agree to waive the 15-day waiting period. So if you're in agreement with the IEP and you think it should go into effect tomorrow, if you sign the IEP in box 3, then that authorizes them to skip the 15-day waiting period and implement the IEP right away. If you don't sign the IEP, as long as it's not your child's first IEP, after the 15 days, the change automatically goes into effect unless you filed for mediation or due process. So that 15 days is important to understand. It's confusing, and we have a pamphlet that we can mail to you, or it's on our website, called Changes in Your Child's Special Education, and it explains all of this 15-day stuff in detail. So feel free to take advantage of that.
Perfect. Our next question comes from a parent. It says, my 5-year-old son diagnosed with autism regressed throughout his disabled preschool class setting, as documented in his progress reports that were received at home after each quarter. We were told not to worry about it since he doesn't need to know his letters and numbers for kindergarten. We asked for more support, which was one-on-one support, and they were refused. Would you have any suggestions or recommendations?
When we get into these individual questions, I obviously can't give you a legal opinion or anything, remotely approaching, the full advice that you're entitled to. But what I can tell you is when there's documented regression, it gives you a significant lever to get additional services. It makes no sense in the world to say that it doesn't matter that he regressed because they decided in his preschool years that it was important to work on those skills. The fact that he didn't learn those skills doesn't mean that they get to say, well, it didn't matter anyway. It mattered, or it wouldn't have been in the IEP. And the fact that you have documented regression gives you greater leverage to get appropriate services, whether it be one-on-one services or something else, I can't say. But that certainly sounds like the beginning of a situation that I would expect to work out in your favor. Districts, when they see regression in the records, they recognize that you're in a comparative position of power, and then hopefully they'll be more likely to be compliant with your requests instead of taking it through the whole fight. But we'd have to talk more about it.
Perfect. And and that's one thing I do want to say. We do have some extremely specific questions, and quite often Ira's going to have to ask you, another 50 questions behind that question to really give you the right advice. So in that situation, we would definitely direct you to reach out directly to the firm. But by all means, we do have a couple more general questions. So Ira, if I can give you 2 more before we end today's session, that would be great.
Sure.
The next one is, how does funding for out-of-school one-on-one instruction work? Are you saying that this is a responsibility of the district to pay rather than going through the insurance, as is often the funding source?
Yes. Okay, let me not be cute. If you saw the picture at the beginning, I couldn't be if I tried. The answer, it's a multifaceted answer. You can go through your insurance. New Jersey has its autism insurance law that many parents have been able to get significant amounts of one-on-one instruction, behavioral instruction out of school, and they haven't had to bother the school district with it at all. In those situations, I would encourage you to make sure that the insurance provider, meaning that the instructor, is coordinating with the school district to make sure that we're not doing apples and oranges and confusing the child more than we're helping him. But if you have access to insurance that will cover these services and you're comfortable with the copays and deductibles and all that, I'm not going to complain or laugh at you for going that route. It can be a very effective way of doing it. There are other agencies that can provide out-of-school behavioral support. The Division of Children and Families, that's where you get into Perform Care and all that. They can provide that type of support. But as the special education guy during the special education lecture, I will say that the school district has no right to insist that you use any of these other sources. If you believe that your child requires out-of-school support for behavior, the school district can ask you to use your insurance, but this is written right in the black letter of the law that they can request that you use your insurance, but they can't require that you use the insurance. So if you want to have that discussion with the school district and insist that they provide those services, or if you don't have the insurance, obviously, or if you're not getting appropriate services through the insurance or through Perform Care, then by all means, don't be afraid to push the district when they say it's not our job, it's some other agency. It's their job, black and white law, and if you want to be cooperative and helpful to take some of the burden off of them, then that fits in with that last slide of be their friend, but you're under no legal obligation to let them off the hook for that.
Great. So the last question we have is going to pertain to social skills. We actually have a few questions around this topic, so I'm going to give it to you in 2 parts, if I could. One of the parents attending today's session has a child on the autism spectrum, and this parent notes that their son has absolutely no social skills. They would like to know if they find a private socialization group, is the district required to cover the cost?
Here's where we're in this gray area. I can't answer. That's one of those questions, Melanie, that, as you point out, I'm glad you put it in these terms. I'd have to ask 50 more questions before I could, come close to giving an answer. But what I will say is that the school district is responsible for appropriately addressing your child's social skills deficits. If they can do it in some way other than providing a private social skills group, meaning they can do it appropriately, meaning that the benefit is significant, it's meaningful, it's generalized, then you don't have a right to ask for more. That's the first lesson they taught you, is that you're only entitled to appropriate, not best. Once they get to appropriate, they're not required to provide anything beyond that, and they're right. So if what they can offer in lieu of the private social skills group is appropriate under these criteria that we've gone through for the past hour, then you'll probably have a hard time getting the after-school social skills program. If what they're offering isn't appropriate, then it puts you in a great position to say, hey, you guys, appreciate your efforts. Thank you for Lunch Bunch, but it's not doing any good. Or thank you for my twice monthly, social skills, sessions, or whatever they're doing. If it's not working, if it's not providing significant and meaningful benefit and allowing your child to significantly and meaningfully improve his or her social skills, then you're in a great position to ask, as a member of the IEP team, equal member, that they provide the private after-school social skills group, and the burden then shifts to them to explain why they don't have to provide it. And if you're not feeling convinced, then that's when jerks like me get involved. And you don't have to wait. I'm sorry, not all attorneys are jerks. I'm not a jerk either, but the after-school private social skills groups are becoming more and more common. So I would encourage that parent, knowing very little, that it's still maybe worthwhile to push on that issue, but it's probably as worthwhile to, let's sit down. And Melanie didn't mention, we do these clinics through the Family Support Center where we have little private mini consults, and I don't know when the next ones are. I don't know if we're doing those at all anymore, Melanie, but that's another plug for the Family Support Center, that we can sometimes have a little mini consult to go over specific questions and get into more detail. But without knowing more, I can't say anything more than what I just said.
Perfect. And the last part of that question is, if the school is recommending that this child receive a social skills program outside of the school, would that parent then have more of a right to have that school reimbursed for that service?
Yes.
Okay.
Get it in writing. That's the key, because they may say, I can see it already. I don't want to belabor this. I know we're over time, but I can see a district saying across the table, oh, there are all these great social skills groups that you can sign Johnny up for, so why don't you do that? But if it's not in writing that they've recommended that, then come due process hearing time, which hopefully you never reach, their explanation will be, we feel our social skills program was appropriate. We were just giving the parents some ideas of outside resources if they wanted to go over and above appropriate. But if you can get them to put in writing that, we recommend that Johnny attend this group, then they're squarely on the hook for it.
Perfect. So I want to thank everyone for spending their lunch hour plus with us. And on behalf of the Family Support Center of New Jersey, along with the law firm of Hinkle, Fingles, and Pryor, we thank you for joining us today. We strongly encourage you to visit our website and register for any of the upcoming webinars that we're offering and in-person sessions. We thank you again. Ira, thank you so much for giving us your time, and we wish everyone a wonderful day.
Thank you all.
Thanks.